Order.
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Minister statements. Minister for Finance.
Madam Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories is committed to maintaining a professional and representative public service. Increasing Indigenous representation within our public service has long been a goal of the Legislative Assembly. The first and most visible tool used by the N.W.T to support this goal is the Affirmative Action Policy. This policy and its implementation are often criticized as being ineffective because the percentage of Indigenous Aboriginal employees in the N.W.T has remained at around 30% for the last several decades. Madam Speaker, the Affirmative Action Policy alone cannot address the root causes that contribute to this lack of growth in Indigenous representation among public servants. We acknowledge that this is a complex issue that will not be solved by a one-size-fits-all approach. Challenges to improved Indigenous representation exist at every stage of a public servant's career path, including hiring, retention, promotion, and succession planning. Over the years, the N.W.T has implemented several programs with the intent of increasing Indigenous representation within the N.W.T. The Indigenous Career Gateway Program, the Regional Recruitment Program, the Internship Program, and the Summer Student Employment Program each take a different approach to bringing Indigenous residents into the public service. Cultural awareness training supports an inclusive workplace culture, and the Indigenous Management Training and Development and Training Program helps Indigenous employees access funds for professional development. Each program has its own benefits, however, and there is always room for improvement to ensure that these programs are used to their full capacity and are as effective as possible. In response to call for action number 57 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Department of Finance, in collaboration with Education, Culture and Employment and Health and Social Services, is redeveloping the cultural awareness and sensitivity training for public service employees. The goals of this training include the creation of awareness and understanding of the impact of colonization, to have all N.W.T's employees recognize our collective roles in reconciliation, and to provide all employees with the necessary foundation and tools to be culturally competent. With the knowledge acquired by participating in this new training, managers and employees will be supported to reflect on ways they can address the root causes of systemic discrimination within their workplaces, personal circumstances, and communities. This training will be mandatory for all N.W.T employees and will be released in the winter of 2021. We recognize the benefit this training can have within our communities and believe it will help our government set an example for the rest of Canada. As such, this training will be available to not only N.W.T public servants, but to the public as well. Madam Speaker, we recognize that these programs are just the first steps on a long road towards addressing the imbalance in Indigenous representation in the N.W.T. There is still much work to do. In addition, the Department of Finance is currently developing an Indigenous recruitment and retention framework that will include departmental Indigenous employee implementation plans with distinct targets. This framework will begin with a look at best practices from other jurisdictions, the development of an Indigenous labour force analysis of the Northwest Territories, and a thorough review of current programs, tools, and resources. We will incorporate feedback received through engagement with Indigenous governments and internal partners, and will ultimately assist each department in reviewing their recruitment and retention to ensure that barriers to employment for Indigenous peoples are identified and addressed across the whole of the N.W.T. Madam Speaker, our people are our territory's greatest resource. Investing in the skills and qualifications of Northerners provides employment for our people and benefits all residents and our economy. Through this important work, we will begin to identify, address, and dismantle the systemic barriers that have prevented the actualization of a representative public service. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Minister Statements. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, land is the foundation of the Northwest Territories, both figuratively and literally. Our government is responsible for managing 1.15 million square kilometres of it. Setting and enforcing clear rules and regulations for how public land is used is a critical part of ensuring the Northwest Territories' land and resources are well managed. Clear, well-communicated rules help the government of the Northwest Territories make sure that everybody understands what can and cannot be done on public land. They also give the government a fair and consistent basis for taking actions against anybody who breaks them. The Department of Lands uses a number of pieces of territorial and federal legislation to help clearly and fairly set and enforce rules on land use. These pieces are further underpinned by the ministerial policy of compliance and enforcement. The primary goal of compliance and enforcement uses this policy is to determine, minimize, and remedy non-compliance. The ministerial policy of compliance enforcement also establishes that enforcement action should be timely and appropriate to the severity of the non-compliance and consider the actual or potential impact on the land and natural resources. Action to manage use of territorial public land and resources under this policy includes informing and educating the public about the rules and requirements and providing support and advice on how to comply with the rules. The policy provides a fair and consistent approach to monitoring compliance. If it is forced on education and building awareness, in short, helping to prevent non-compliance wherever possible and resolving any non-compliance before it impacts the land or natural resources. Where non-compliance cannot be resolved, the policy sets out a consistent approach that seeks remedies to fix any harm caused by non-compliance or to impose sanctions, including laying charges under relevant legislation. Consistent with this approach, the Department regards unauthorized occupancy as one of the most severe incidents of non-compliance. Members of the public can report potential incidents of unauthorized occupancy by calling local lands regional office. Contact information is available on the Department's website. The Government of Northwest Territories recognize that land and resources are significant importance to Indigenous governments and organizations. Since 2018, the Department of Lands has supported increased regional Indigenous government and organizations to identify and document cabins that support traditional use of the land. As part of our ongoing enforcement efforts, the Department will continue to post notices on untendered structures. This first notice is an opportunity for the occupant to come forward and identify or clarify any legal basis for their occupancy. As the Department moves this work forward, we are working with Indigenous governments and organizations to ensure there is a clear process for when a cabin that is associated with the Aboriginal rights assertion is posted. The Government of Northwest Territories is committed to the responsible management and use of N.W.T lands, resources, and environment. To this end, the Department will be bringing the Public Land Act into force that applies to all public land in the Northwest Territories and bringing clarity to all land users. Madam Speaker, we are all stewards of the land. We all know our responsibilities. We want to ensure the people of the Northwest Territories know that the Department of Land is continuing to take action by supporting a clear, consistent, enforced land management regime. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Minister Statements. Minister for Infrastructure.
Madam Speaker, the 19th Legislative Assembly is committed to making strategic infrastructure investments that connects our communities, expand our economy, and reduce the cost of living. from highways to airports to buildings, I would like to provide an update today on significant progress our government has made to improve public infrastructure across the territory. Our government has approved over 200 kilometres of highway this year. We have completed 105 kilometres of new chip seal surface on Highway 1 and reconstructed the N.W.T Airport access road. Residents can expect a smoother and safer driving experience. These improvements were made possible by funding from the Government of Canada's New Building Canada Plan. I thank our federal colleagues for their continued collaboration and support. In addition to improving the existing highway system, over 85 kilometres of embankment has been constructed for the new all-season road to N.W.T, which is scheduled to open next fall. This project is now more than 70% complete and a great accomplishment, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Madam Speaker, airports are an essential part of our transportation system. Communities across the north depend on air travel for movement of goods and people, air ambulances, search and rescue, forest fire response, and much more. Airports also play a role in supporting economic opportunities. This fiscal year, over $16 million was invested to enhance operations and services at 13 of our airports, including drainage and runway improvements and the replacement of older equipment. 3 major capital projects are in the works at the N.W.T Mike Zuko Airport. The new air terminal building is planned to open in 2023. At the same time, improvements will be made to the airfield drainage, which will increase the resiliency of the airport to the effects of climate change. The design of a 3,000-foot runway extension is moving ahead as planned on behalf of the Department of National Defence. Madam Speaker, we continue to invest in our public buildings. Several major projects are underway across the territory, including a multi-year project to replace the Ecole J.H. Sisson School in Yellowknife. Our department is working with the Department of Education, Culture and Employment on this project, which will result in larger, more modern and accessible facilities for students. In Tuktoyaktuk, another school project is underway. Our government is in the process of renovating and expanding the Mangalalak School. The project will increase the school's capacity, improve site access, upgrade aging building systems, and will include a community library space and a new gymnasium. A tender to complete the tenant improvement at the Stanton Legacy Building is scheduled to close on November 6, 2020. The estimate completion schedule is spring 2022. Madam Speaker, infrastructure projects will continue to play an important role in the economic recovery to the Northwest Territories post-COVID-19. These projects provide business and employment opportunities for our residents, boosting the economy while delivering the critical infrastructure that this territory needs to provide key program and services to our residents. Kuya ni, Madam Speaker.
Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Tabacha.
Madam Speaker, I rise today along with my colleagues to speak about the affirmative action policy in the Northwest Territories. My focus in this member statement is to talk about the many gaps that exist within the policy. Madam Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories created the affirmative action policy to hire underrepresented groups of people in the public service, to ensure the government is representative of the population it serves. The designated groups are Indigenous Aboriginal persons, P1s, Indigenous non-Aboriginal persons, P2s, resident disabled persons, P3s, and resident women, P4s. Madam Speaker, while the affirmative action policy has existed in the N.W.T since March of 1989, it remains to be an imperfect policy. There are gaps in this policy which people have been falling through since it was created. The gaps I'm referring to, however, are generally harder to measure and can be susceptible to manipulation through statistics, which hides many of the problems. Madam Speaker, the main problem with the affirmative action is not the policy itself, but rather the people who are doing the hiring. Everyone in the North knows there's a huge issue of nepotism, of people hiring their friends, or their manager's friends or relatives, or people tailoring job descriptions to match a particular person's resume, or people who put the qualifications for certain jobs very high because they assume an Indigenous person could not meet those qualifications, and so on. Madam Speaker, the problem with affirmative action is that it is so easy for interviews to find weaknesses in applicants, which is then used to rationalize to screen out certain applications from job competitions. Though more often than not, Madam Speaker, it is the Indigenous candidates who get screened out the earliest and at a greater degree than non-Indigenous candidates. Madam Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude their statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
In closing, Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, I am happy that the Government of the Northwest Territories has the affirmative action policy. However, as I just outlined, there are still some real gaps within this policy that must be filled. This policy was meant to provide Indigenous people an equal footing with non-Indigenous people in the public service. It has helped with that, but until Indigenous employment reaches 50% to match the overall Indigenous population of the N.W.T, we have not hit our mark. I will have questions for the Minister responsible for Human Resources later today. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member statements. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, prior to 1989, this government recognized an inequity with respect to the lack of Indigenous representation in the N.W.T public sector. In an attempt to address that inequity, the affirmative action policy was established. The policy was designed to offer priority hiring to candidates belonging to eligible designated groups that are underrepresented within the public service. These groups include not only Indigenous persons, but also recognized Indigenous non-Aboriginal persons, resident disabled persons, and resident women. Madam Speaker, the intent of the affirmative action policy goes further than just trying to meet quotas for an eligible target group. Included is the need for training, promotions, and counseling of potential candidates. Subsequently, in 2009, this government further established the Indigenous Employment Advisory Committee with the intent of actively increasing the representation of Indigenous Aboriginal persons at all levels of the public service. Madam Speaker, to this day, even with the policy and committee in place, our government has failed to meet its intent and goals for Indigenous Aboriginal people. Our inclusion of Indigenous Aboriginal employees in the public service has advanced slowly and appears to have stalled. I hear concerns from potential candidates who I know possess the experience and education for the position they applied on, but then say they are routinely turned away or are screened out of the interview process. Madam Speaker, I then ask myself, what is the real stumbling block to recruitment of Indigenous people into the public service? I know it's not the lack of qualified Indigenous Aboriginal peoples in the N.W.T. This brings me to the matter of the interview process and format. I am of the belief that our failure starts at the first stage of recruitment, and that is with the qualification requirements, interview format, and interview process. Due to cultural differences, the current process and format does not acknowledge, give weight to, and respect Aboriginal Indigenous knowledge and the way we learn, communicate, or present ourselves during the interview process. Madam Speaker, no matter how many policies we have in place, no matter how many committees we have in place, we will not make a difference without the political will, political direction to bureaucracy, a policy that is clear, concise, and unambiguous, and a process that adopts and recognizes Indigenous people and our culture. Madam Speaker, if we expect success in increasing Indigenous Aboriginal participation in the public sector, then we must review the existing affirmative action policy and recruitment process and be willing to commit that political will. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member statements. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As you know, after more than 30 years of lobbying and planning, the design of the Tuck-Inuvik Highway opened up in 2017. Since the opening, the ITH has been a lifeline for the community of Tuck. It's reduced the basic needs such as food, clothing and supplies. Importantly, we can get to Inuvik Hospital quickly for medical services. It's also been to visit family, friends and relatives in Inuvik and to use the facilities there. I'm proud to say the project was built on budget, on time by local contractors, Madam Speaker. It's the highest amount of Indigenous local employment participation in any major project undertaken by our Northwest Territories government. It was built due to care, sensitive on our Arctic permafrost environment. However, at that time, with a tight budget, the N.W.T had to reduce overall height of the road in several spots or locations along the highway. During construction, engineers advised the government that this would require additional maintenance and upgrading in the future. Well, it's time for upgrading, Madam Speaker. Since it opened, the ITH only needed regular maintenance such as grading, resurfacing and gravel and snow plowing. But after 3 years, there's some areas for the embankment is reduced to now sinking and needs to be lifted. Few sections of the road need level to adjacent to the permafrost, causing melting and many potholes and washboard during driving surface. This situation is urgent, Madam Speaker. It will only become worse to increase the next few years, especially when the invalid project development of M18 gas project gets underway and starts utilizing that road 365 days a year with LNG trucks, tankers. This project will allow, I do not see where the funds have been allocated for the capital plan to deal with this critical upgrading. Recently, the Hamlet of Tuck and the Tuck Community Corp sent a joint letter to the Minister with these concerns. I'm following up on their behalf, Madam Speaker. The work can be done with our local contractors and workforce. They're critical to bring forward projects shovel ready to go to that we could help our residents and businesses survive during this pandemic. We need urgent action to protect our valuable asset, ensuring maintenance is done this coming year. Madam Speaker, I will have questions for the Minister at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Member statements. Member for Cam Lake.
Madam Speaker, on Monday I spoke of the disproportionate effects of the pandemic on women. When I asked the Premier what an Indigenous feminist approach to social and economic recovery would look like, she responded that there would not be a one-size-fits-all approach and that each community would be empowered to determine what that looks like. Excuse me, sorry. This is good news, but it does not explain what steps the N.W.T is taking to make changes regarding the bills it sponsors, the regulations it develops, the programs and services it delivers directly to the residents of the Northwest Territories, and how it hires people into the public service. This government made a commitment in this House to work on an action plan to support the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. The calls for justice identify the need for an approach to undo colonialism and re-establish Indigenous nationhood. It calls on government to work differently by challenging colonial influence and making space for marginalized Indigenous perspectives. Specifically, 4.4 calls on all governments to provide supports and resources for educational, training, and employment opportunities for all Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. Madam Speaker, representation is important. This government decides on programs, services, laws, and regulations that are meant to support, empower, and protect its residents. For this work to be effective and reflective of Northern realities, the demographic of this government's workforce needs to include small community, regional, and city voices, and it needs to include representative Indigenous and female voices. 44 years ago, Commissioner Stuart Hodgson published a paper identifying the GNWT's need for an affirmative action policy because the Indigenous representation within the GNWT was only 30%. Today we have an affirmative action policy, and today only 30% of the GNWT workforce is Indigenous. The Department of Finance has designed programs to increase Indigenous representation within the public service. For example, Indigenous Career Gateway, regional recruitment, and Indigenous management training programs are available to all GNWT departments. But what direction is given to departments to use these programs, and what role does every department play in increasing Indigenous representation and in turn supporting the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls calls for justice? Madam Speaker, increasing Indigenous representation is a shared responsibility of all departments, just as the safety of Indigenous women and girls is shared by every single one of us, regardless of race, colour, ancestry, place of origin, or gender identity. Today I will have questions for the Premier at the appropriate time. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le ministre de l'Éducation a mis fin en août à plusieurs années de conflits et d'incertitudes pour les élèves et les familles francophones en abrogeant la directive ministérielle sur l'inscription des élèves au programme d'enseignement en français langue première. Cette directive, qui a pendant trop longtemps fait l'objet de multiples procédures judiciaires coûteuses, a été remplacée par un nouveau règlement encadrant l'admission aux écoles francophones. Le nouvel règlement a été accueilli favorablement par la Commission. Enfin, la CSFTNO se voit déléguer la responsabilité du processus d'admission aux écoles francophones. Le règlement élargit par ailleurs I click for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. The Commission Scolaire Francophone des Territoires Nord-Ouest were warned in their praise on the new regulations on school admissions. However, a few issues remain outstanding. First, can the Minister tell us why his department persists in its appeals? 3 students have been enrolled this year under the new regulations, and 6 students who are subject to the ongoing court case have been tentatively admitted and will remain students pending the outcome of the appeals. It is not clear why the N.W.T continues with its appeals. Overall, the limits last year was about renewed collaboration between the board and the department, and congratulate them and CSFTNO. Overall, though, the new minister last year has brought renewed collaboration between the board, department, and I congratulate him and CSFTNO. I have questions. And I congratulate him and the CSFTO. I will have questions out today for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment on some issues still facing CSFTNO and its schools. Thank you.
Member statements. Member for Deschaux.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I understand the current government of the Northwest Territories affirmative action policy began around 1976 and was related to a report from the Commissioner of the day, the late Stuart Hodson. The report was the Hodson Report, and it set out to achieve training positions for Native Northerners in order to meet the objective of increased Aboriginal employment in the public service. This led to the creation of the Office of Native Employment. That office developed a discussion paper in which it was noted the difficulty in employing Aboriginal people in numbers reflective of their ratio to the general population. In 1984, the then Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, the late John Parker, commissioned a discussion paper, the Parker Report, which recommended the development of a Native employment policy. The report also noted concerns with the constitutionality of an affirmative action program directed specifically at Aboriginal people born and raised in the Northwest Territories. The report notes that the Canadian Human Rights Commission raised concerns the affirmative action policy could be challenged under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Madam Speaker, in 1985, the Native Employment Policy recommended increasing Aboriginal representation in the public service from 30% to 52% by 1990. What was noted by a review in 1989 was that the increase was only 2% from the years 1985 to 1989. Madam Speaker, the report of the day by another firm indicated most government jobs back in 1989 only required a grade 10 education, and noted a majority of Native people had less than a grade 9 education. The report also goes on to state 48% of today's N.W.T jobs require a university degree, and that only about 6% of the Aboriginal population had a university degree. Madam Speaker, I would like to point out that in the many meetings with the senior management teams of the N.W.T that I was involved with, I did not see any First Nations people amongst them. Merci, Madam Speaker.
Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate my colleague, the member from the date show. Sorry, my mask got caught on my glasses. Bringing up the history of this, because I think that the affirmative action policy is a white elephant. A white elephant is a possession that its maintenance is out of proportion to its usefulness. And the affirmative action policy, after decades, has failed to deliver on its promises. Indigenous employment remains at 30%. Even P2s, which are an unconstitutional, according to various reports, have not increased. They remain at 12% in the N.W.T. And I think what's happened is consecutive N.W.T governments have looked at this report, seen that risk of, a charter challenge and gone, better just not touch that, better leave it there. But the reality is we are open to that charter challenge anytime. Anyone at any time who is not hired by the N.W.T and thinks that the affirmative action policy discriminated them can bring a charter challenge. And it's likely a losing case, according to the reports. So I believe this Assembly needs to finally address this problem. And it's not a popular solution. I think everyone in this room recognizes there's a value to people born in the North working in a public service. Indigenous people, I think, want to hire Indigenous people born in the North, not just Indigenous people, period, which is likely what the Charter would uphold. So there are some unpopular decisions to be made here, but we have to make them, and we have to make sure we have an affirmative action policy that actually works, because it's not working right now. And I recognize that the labor force and the needs of the N.W.T do not align, and in many ways our affirmative action policy is trying to address a symptom, and we must do more to educate our citizens. I believe the work of the Polytechnic can make sure we are producing more university degrees. I also recognize we're not the only game in town. Many Indigenous people would prefer to work for their Indigenous government. It's a largely more exciting work. But when I hear that, I struggle, because when I look across the N.W.T, I see powers and mandates that shouldn't belong in the N.W.T, that should be devolved to Indigenous governments. So I think there are multiple solutions here. One is building our education capacity. One is setting clear targets. I want to walk away from this Assembly, and if it's 30% and we get to 33%, at least we made a little progress. So we need to set clear targets, and we need to work with our Indigenous governments to once and for all get an affirmative action policy that works and is legal. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member statements. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the theme today, and instead I would like to recognize a constituent of the District of Great Slave, 10-year-old Jack Penny. This year, Jack submitted his film, Eat Your Carrots, to the N.W.T-based Dead North Film Festival. Eat Your Carrots is a fantasy horror short that was written and directed by Jack when he was only 9 years old. Jack is currently in grade 5 at a Cole J.H. Sisson school, and in his spare time is an avid reader and snowboarder. He's also the best big brother to sister Lucy Dandelion. Jack faced many challenges during the filming of Eat Your Carrots, which included his cat Pixie stealing his Lego pieces, as well as the difficulty of filming in the North in March. Jack's film was such a hit at the festival that it won the Zombear Award for the best death scene. This involved blowing up a snowman, and our own Legislative Assembly clerk, Michael Ball, contributed his explosives expertise for this scene. Recently, Eat Your Carrots was picked up as an official selection of the national Toronto-based Blood in the Snow Film Festival, which is currently being hosted and aired on Super Channel until November 8th. Jack is also planning on submitting his film to the Dawson City Film Festival. Jack's cinematic success at such a young age is a good example of how the N.W.T strives to foster its creative community. This winter, there will be many virtual events taking place which will allow everyone to attend, not just those lucky enough to get a ticket, as has often been the case in the past. For example, the Yellowknife International Film Festival runs from today, November 4th, to November 8th, and anyone can attend from the comfort of their homes with no need to get out of their sweats. And while the Dead North Film Festival will not take place this year, there is still funding available through the N.W.T for artists. In fact, in the 2020-2021 fiscal year, there is $250,000 up for grabs for the creative industries. This funding is open to several artistic arenas, including performance, Indigenous cultural works, film, and visual arts. I strongly encourage all Northern artists to apply. In conclusion, I would again like to congratulate Jack Penny on his success on the national stage, as he has a very bright future ahead of him, and I'm proud to call him my constituent and my neighbour. Thank you.
Member statements. Member for Montfouille.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker,
Madam Speaker, there's a lot of workers in the Northwest Territories. There's approximately 5,000 employees. Not only that, but we have a lot of workers all over the place, Indigenous, Inuit, Métis people. They are hired by who they are, and sometimes in the Northwest Territories, people are hired differently.
Single source of work in the Northwest Territories. It is the largest single employer of Indigenous people. That makes our government absolutely essential for employment prospects of Indigenous people. No matter how you look at it, our Indigenous people look to our government for work and opportunity. Madam Speaker, it's not only to keep food on tables of our Dene, Inuvialuit, and Métis people, it's also to ensure that our government reflects on the values and cultures of our people. Madam Speaker, this is why I'm so troubled by the current underrepresentation of Indigenous people of our government. Indigenous people make up 50% of this population of Northwest Territories, but they make up only 30% of N.W.T workforce. And it's been stuck at a low rate for so long, Madam Speaker, decades and decades. Madam Speaker, it's time that our government got serious about fixing this disparity. It's time that we tackle the root cause. Madam Speaker, let's talk about education, because education is the key to employment. And as we all know, Indigenous Northern Trail behind non-Indigenous on the education front, both in high school and post-secondary. Madam Speaker, until we deal with this education gap, that deck will remain stacked against the Indigenous seeking work in our government. Some people think the education gap will not be solved in our lifetime. They think it's a bit too big, too complex. But Madam Speaker, they're totally wrong. Break a big problem down to component parts. It's not a big problem at all. The education gap is no different. It is underrepresented of our people in the government. Madam Speaker, here's a real example drawn from this government's stats. The problem of underrepresentation is really a huge challenge of male representation. Female representation in N.W.T within acceptable limits. In fact, Indigenous male employment, that's corporate. They have half the employment rate of women. Indigenous men make up 9% of total N.W.T workforce. 9%, Madam Speaker. So I will have questions to the Minister of Finance pertaining to this. Merci.
Member statements. Member for Range Lake.
Madam Speaker, Max Ward was born on November 22, 1921 in Edmonton, Alberta. In 1940, Max joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and received his pilot's wings in 1941. Max worked as an instructor at various training bases during the Second World War until its end in 1945. After being discharged from the Air Force, Max received his commercial pilot's license and began his flying career as a bush pilot in Yellowknife. In 1946, Max started Polaris Charter Company Limited, carrying passengers throughout the Arctic, including prospectors and supplies into mining exploration camps. In 1948, Max and George Pigeon formed Yellowknife Airways, combining their two aircraft into one company. Max moved to Alberta after liquidating his share in 1949. It wasn't the last the North saw of Max, Madam Speaker. In 1953, he acquired a 14-passenger single-engine Otter and launched Ward Air Limited into commercial service. Madam Speaker, Max Ward revolutionized the aviation industry in Canada's north. Ward Air expanded every year, and in 1957, he purchased the company's first heavy aircraft, a Bristol freighter, and eventually made the first landing of an aircraft on wheels at the geographic North Pole. In 1966, Ward Air became the third major Canadian carrier to operate pure jet aircraft when they purchased a Boeing 727, the first ever in Canada. Madam Speaker, by 1973, they had become Canada's largest international air charter carrier. But times change, and Max sold the company in 1989 to Pacific Western Airlines, bringing an end to one of the greatest chapters in the history of Canadian aviation. The impact Max had on the Canadian aviation industry has been immeasurable, Madam Speaker. He was inducted into the Canadian Aviation Hall of Fame in 1974, was awarded the Order of Canada in 1975, and was inducted into the Alberta Order of Excellence in 1989, amongst a host of other awards. Madam Speaker, Max helped blaze the trail for generations of pilots to explore the world around them and to find a home in the north where they could fly one of the most unique aviation experiences in the world today. Madam Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Max passed away peacefully on November 2nd, 2020 in Edmonton, Alberta at 98 years of age. His contribution to the Northwest Territories will forever be remembered. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Our thoughts and prayer with the family. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of the visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today my questions for the Minister of Infrastructure in regards to the Acknowledgements Highway. Would the Minister commit to meeting with the Mayor and the community of Tuktoyaktuk Community Corporation Chair to come up with a plan to address the concerns in the letter that was sent to the Minister's office? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I am traveling with the infrastructure team to the Beaufort Delta the week of November 17th, and I will get in touch with the member to see if we can make some time to be able to discuss the letter that was sent to me on Friday. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We'll invite it to Atukka on November 18th. The N.W.T, Madam Speaker, currently sitting on $450 million capital plan. Would that seem to have trouble getting out the door? Why can't the N.W.T look at projects that are to be done by the local contractors around the territory to prioritize them, help them stimulate our regional economies during this pandemic? The ITH would be a great place to start. What is the N.W.T planning to find the necessary funding? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we are currently doing some assessment on the condition of the road. Once we get that back, we'll be able to determine and perhaps even build a case, a case for the project, and then determine what's the next step. And I understand that the letter from the community identifies a bunch of specific areas along the N.W.T highway that does need some work. So that is something that we can build a case for once we get the report. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With our new regional energy project going to get underway, M18, IRC will have many more heavy loads on the ITH, wear and tear from tractor trailers, 18-wheelers coming with LNG into Inuvik to service the community. But having no budget and funding in place to get that road ready prior to that happening, that needs to be done. We could do studies. It's studied. We had former minister there in the community and yourself come and do the road. So we've seen some potholes in the washboard. You see it's low and the grade is level with the highway. I think there's certain places, and it's probably between $5 to $10 million worth of work coming up. So February coming up in the budget session, I'm asking for $10 million for the Tuck-Inuvik Highway to get that service done. So is the minister willing to work with the community and myself to get that project started? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the process would be to define the scope and the need, then come up with a plan, and then cost it out, and then come forward with the SUP. That's the process on looking at some funding for this work. And I don't know how much it's going to cost, but it's something that that we can work with the member. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank the minister for that. 2015, when we got that road approved in this House, and I could tell you when they had the Prime Minister of Canada the day was Stephen Harper come in and tell us that, we're getting the funds. And the N.W.T, it was the ITH, the Tuck-Inuvik Highway, but he corrected everybody. And it's a Dempster Highway. It's an extension of the Dempster Highway. So the funding that we get for the Dempster, it would be easier just to keep it as a Dempster Highway, not unless the community wants to rename the road. And I think it's the investment of the federal government in regards to all the oil and gas I have up there. I mean, we could get out of debt. Just help me help you. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Member, Minister, did you have any comments? Thank you. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the geography of the Northwest Territories is made up of the different representative land areas of First Nations, Métis, and the Inuvialuit groups. This demographic representation should dictate how the Northwest Territories is governed, and for that matter, how the workforce should be representative of the people the public service serves. My question to the Minister of Finance is what commitment can the N.W.T make to increase representation of the majority demographic of the Northwest Territories into the public service, and most notably into senior management? Merci.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, there are quite a number of programs already in existence that are meant to support and encourage applicants to the public service and growth within the public service. One of the newer things that is being rolled out imminently is a framework that will address exactly the question of the member, which is to create some targets department by department, including into the management ranks. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Decho.
Merci, Madam Speaker, and merci to the Minister for her answer. I just want to say this with no prejudice or disrespect to my Yellowknife colleagues. But what is noted is the majority of the public service jobs are in Yellowknife, and that many new positions that are being created are being located in Yellowknife. Can the minister explain why this arrangement continues with no regard for the outlying communities? Merci.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, one of the other commitments of this, the 19th Legislative Assembly, of course, is to increase employment in regional centres. That's a commitment of the 19th Assembly and of this government, and is certainly one that the Department of Finance also plays a role in. There is ongoing efforts to ensure that when new positions are being created, efforts are made to consider whether they have to, in fact, be centralized in the capital, which sometimes is the case depending on the nature of the work, depending on the nature of the role to be played. But if it is not the case, then it need not be centred here. For instance, recently the ISSS had some positions created within the last year, and they were all located in Fort Smith. So, because it was recognized that they did not have to be located in the capital. So those efforts are ongoing. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Deschaux.
Merci, Madam Speaker, and merci to the Minister for that. I didn't hear of any positions going to the small communities, but I recall a program in the N.W.T that is to promote residents, or I believe only current employees, with an option to move up in the ranks. The program is the Associate Director Program, where an employee can job shadow an existing director for 2 years to eventually take over as director. I believe it's in the event the director is planning on leaving the N.W.T workforce. The program had real ambition as a succession planning success story. Can the minister review the number of directors' positions in the N.W.T and how many are actually First Nations? Merci.
Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I certainly do have those numbers and can provide those numbers to the House and to the member. I don't have them at my fingertips, as I wasn't expecting to be called on to give those numbers here, but I would be more than happy to provide that. And just would note that certainly succession planning has been and remains a challenge for many organizations, and the government is no different. So I certainly appreciate bringing some attention to the need to continue our succession planning here in the N.W.T. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Deschaux.
Merci, Madam Speaker. I know from first-hand, working for the N.W.T for over 11 years, that this program was in place. As an employee of the N.W.T, I had problem even access or gaining access to this program. Nobody wanted to recognize it. There may be many succession planning documents out there. The last one, I think, was the 2020 A Brighter Future, which is probably expired this year. And no actions have ever been taken for any planning documents. And we're always getting just lip service. And, you know, I'm telling you my first hand that I had problems even trying to move up within the N.W.T. I wonder if the minister can commit to reviewing the Associate Director Program and ensure these will be filled by First Nations residents of the Northwest Territories. Merci.
Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'll certainly commit to reviewing the succession planning that is underway within the N.W.T. As I've indicated at the beginning of the members' questions, the direction right now is to develop the Indigenous framework, have that go department by department, and to create some targets and that will actually then be applicable to each department. And within that, of course, includes the need for succession planning, the need for those targets to include management. So I will make the commitment that we're going to look at those targets, but I want to provide some flexibility that we aren't necessarily doing that with a succession planning program that may no longer, as the member I think has pointed out, be the one that is at the forefront. So yes, so I mean, again, the commitment is to make sure that we're putting the right targets in and that the targets include senior management. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tabacha.
Madam Speaker, the Minister must be very firm to all of the senior management within the government to ensure that the affirmative action policy is followed. Mechanisms must be put in place to address the gaps, and if not followed, there has to be a process of meaningful appeals with a neutral panel and very concise direction. Does the Minister agree? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, there's certainly, I certainly would agree that there should be a meaningful appeal process. There are indeed staffing appeals. They are conducted by staffing review officers who are in fact outside of the government and appointed by me as being the minister responsible for the public service. And that flows from the fact that, yes, simply put, Madam Speaker, I agree that there has to be a proper, fair and neutral appeals process. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha.
Madam Speaker, the Minister must also be able to discipline those senior managers who are not following the policy. This should be done through job evaluations or disciplinary letters on their work files. Strong, decisive action must be taken to address this issue. Does the Minister agree? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I certainly would agree that every department, through its Deputy Minister, will need to take responsibility to help ensure that the N.W.T continues to do better in terms of what we're doing to follow the affirmative action policy, and not just follow the affirmative action policy. The goal here is to have a representative workforce. That's the affirmative action policy is one of the tools that we use to achieve that. But, Madam Speaker, the way that we'll do that through Deputy Ministers is by ensuring that there's some clear targets and a clear plan for each of them within their department that they can implement and that can then be followed through on to ensure that they are then in turn each doing that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha.
Madam Speaker, the Minister has an ability to make a difference on this whole file. Leadership must be shown at the top in order to advance the Government of the Northwest Territories affirmative action to its fullness. Does the Minister agree? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister.
Madam Speaker, I couldn't agree more. Madam Speaker, it has to start from the top, and that includes obviously this House. It includes each minister and their responsibility for their departments, and it includes each deputy minister within their departments. That is one of the hopes of the Indigenous of the framework, is that it will now create meaningful targets that are department specific and something that can actually be followed and looked at, so that we know that it's not just the minister responsible for public service who has to be responsible for this, but that every department, every minister and every deputy minister is going to be responsible and know exactly what they are responsible for. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Tabacha.
Madam Speaker, there can be no more gaps. No excuses, no nepotism, no conflict of interest, no hiring of friends, no tailoring job descriptions to match certain people's resumes. Only strictly professional, neutral decisions based on qualifications. Will the Minister commit to changing the way senior management and human resource superintendents apply the affirmative action policy to accomplish its original intent? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tabacha. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, what I want to commit to doing is ensuring that every department and the chain of hiring that goes through that department in cooperation and in conjunction with staff from Human Resources are indeed taking responsibility to ensure a representative public service, and indeed are taking responsibility to follow the affirmative action policy, but also to be conscious of their own biases and act in such a way that we are not relying on them. The point of Human Resources is to try to create a system and a process that is fair, that is open, and that acknowledges that human beings will naturally at times have have to look outside of themselves and have to have structures and processes to help them act without bias, to help them act in a neutral way, to accomplish exactly what it is that the member's asking me. So I'm certainly going to commit to ensure that, again, that we have those process, that clear target, and something that works and is applicable to each and every department throughout that chain. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, my questions today are for the Premier. I'm wondering if the Premier can tell me what specific direction she has given to the Deputy Ministers of each N.W.T department to support building a representative workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this government is committed to ensuring that that we adhere to the affirmative action policy. We've heard it for many, many years, and it's time to make sure that we do work on that. Deputy ministers are accountable for all of the hiring within their departments. They might not do it directly, but they are accountable for it. So right now, as stated in the opening statement from the minister's statement, the Department of Finance is currently developing a GNWT Indigenous recruitment and retention framework. Once that's done, this will be complemented by department-specific plans, as stated by the Minister, that set Indigenous representation targets and recruitment plans for each individual department. And then these representation targets will be set for Deputy Ministers on an annual basis. So, Madam Speaker, every year there's an annual evaluation done of Deputy Ministers. Once this work is done, this accountability for Indigenous, for our affirmative action policy, will be part of the evaluation framework that I conduct with the Deputy Ministers going forward. Thank you, Madam Chair. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm very excited to hear about the Indigenous framework that the GNWT is currently working on. But does this mean that there are currently no direction given to Deputy Ministers currently sitting at the heads of departments waiting for this framework to be established? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Absolutely not. The affirmative action policy, Deputy Ministers are aware that this is a priority of this government, and they're aware that they will be evaluated when it comes up. So they are aware that this is coming. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm wondering if the current Cabinet will commit to reviewing the affirmative action policy in over the course of this term. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Absolutely, we will make a commitment to reviewing the affirmative action policy within the term of this government. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Premier. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this past spring, the GNWT committed to a Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Calls for Justice action plan. I'm wondering if the GNWT's plan will include an internal focus to shift the corporate culture of the GNWT. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to defer that to the Minister of Status of Women, or Minister of Finance. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, that does involve both of those two hats coming together. The action plan that is going to be developed in response to the national inquiry is one that needs to, by the nature of what it is, involve a lot of engagement with Indigenous governments, with outside stakeholders, with members of the public, as well as members of the GNWT internally. So as far as what will necessarily be in that plan, that remains to be seen, subject to all that process. That said, Madam Speaker, with respect to the corporate culture, the culture of the GNWT, absolutely that, one of the goals of doing so is most likely that it should and will change the culture of the GNWT as we go through that process. But as well, similarly, the Indigenous framework that I've been speaking about today, Madam Speaker, I hope will also be something that provides a shift and a change in mindset and a change in the way people look creatively when, for example, if somebody doesn't quite meet a cutoff target on an interview question, are there ways that they can look at that and question why somebody may not have done that? But in addition to that, one last comment, Madam Speaker, is that one of the other things that's coming out from the Department of Finance quite imminently is a new Indigenous cultural awareness and sensitivity training. This is an update, the first update in quite a few many years around the kind of training that that all N.W.T employees are now going to be required to attend. And again, the goal of that is to be culture changing and to change all of our mindsets and increase everyone's awareness. So I think there's quite a number of ways in which we do indeed want to change in culture and evolve our culture and bring it forward to really be a leader in Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Finance. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Minister and I both received an email recently in which the sender indicated that in 2010, the pay gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous N.W.T employees was reported as $20,000 annually. Can the Minister tell me if the Public Service Annual Report still contains information regarding the distribution of salaries between P1s, P2s and P3s, and if not, why not? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the report that will be tabled later today does not include that same documentation or data that was back in 2010. As for the evolution in the last 10 years of the report, I will have to find out what that evolution is. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it's my understanding that the N.W.T considers Indigenous non-Aboriginal as a distinct category in its HR policies. Can the Minister please explain to us what this means and how this designation is incorporated into N.W.T statistics around meeting affirmative action goals? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, with respect to management positions or non-traditional positions, there are different designations depending on a person's status. Priority 1A is for Indigenous Aboriginal persons, so persons who are both born in the Northwest Territories and are of an Indigenous background and female. And then Priority 1B is the same categorization of being Indigenous and Aboriginal but male. And then number 2 is resident women, number 3 is Indigenous non-Aboriginal persons or resident disabled persons, and last there's no priority. With respect to all other competitions, so often, so again that's the non-management competitions and things that are not in the non-traditional category. This is where you get your P1 or Priority 1, which is Indigenous Aboriginal persons, P2, which is Indigenous non-Aboriginal, so in other words someone born in the Northwest Territories but not of Indigenous descent, and then there's no priority. And all of those different categories are considered in the data that gets gathered up by Human Resources to evaluate the nature of our public service. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I've had numerous friends and constituents discuss with me their stories of qualified, educated, Indigenous Aboriginal candidates, or P1s, who are unable to advance within their departments, including in the Minister's own. Can the Minister please commit to performing a review of her own department's hiring and looking for the circles of friends in senior management that are often a barrier to the advancement of Indigenous candidates or for advancing complaints under her HR policies? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, since taking on the portfolio of the Department of Finance, one of the most frequent things that comes to my office from MLAs and from members of the public comes in around staffing and concerns around staffing processes and a desire to ensure fairness in staffing processes and ensure that the affirmative action policy is properly being followed. And Madam Speaker, on the vast majority of the cases that come forward when they are investigated, in fact, the policies have been applied and have been followed, and yet the stories and the concerns keep coming. So there is some sort of disconnect where people are applying and going through these processes and feeling that they're not being heard, and yet the application of the process itself is being followed. So that is exactly a conversation that I have had directly with Human Resources. Human Resources works hard and cares deeply about being a representative public service. To have these kinds of stories continue to come forward is not what anybody wants, and it's not what the staff that work there want, and it's not what they're working towards. So yes, I absolutely am committing to the fact that there's, again, the framework approach that we're trying to utilize is meant to be one that's going to give each department looking at what are the barriers, what are the problems in the department. Is it at the front end of recruitment? Is it at the advancement? Is it in succession planning? Is it in the structure of the interview? Is it in the job description? And the answers might be different department by department. So I want to ensure that, that the member won't have to hear all those stories all over again. So that is exactly the point of what we're doing with that framework. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm glad to hear the Minister acknowledge the disconnect. I'm always hesitant when I hear about investigations or analysis done by a department on its own department, so maybe more of a comment, but it would be nice to have the Minister commit to having independent third parties look at the N.W.T's policies. I don't believe that they are being followed and would like to see these changed. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm not really sure what else to say. When those matters come to my desk, we take them back, we follow it carefully, and I don't just accept the responses that come back from the department. We make inquiries, and those responses are that when they're being told that something is being followed, I do believe that people are not lying to me from the public service and that they are in fact saying the truth when they say they've followed a policy. That doesn't mean that we don't have things to fix. So, Madam Speaker, again, there's a lot of things being done right now. Staffing appeals, as I said earlier, are themselves done independently. The in-framework process that's being developed is department by department, and there are going to be targets for those in positions of authority and power within and throughout departments so that they are meeting those targets along the way. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, prior to the creation of the affirmative action policy, the deficit of Indigenous Aboriginal hires within the public sector has been and continues to be a problem for this government. Madam Speaker, will the Minister of Finance confirm the percentage of Indigenous Aboriginal men and women currently employed within the N.W.T public sector, and are we moving in a forward direction? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I have the numbers for 2020 as of March 31st, 2020 in front of me, affirmative action statistics. That is, Indigenous Aboriginal females make up just under 21% of the workforce, Indigenous Aboriginal males just shy of 9% of the workforce. As far as change over time, Madam Speaker, I will look at those numbers and provide them. I do have them here, just not right in front of me right now. I don't think there's been significant change over time from my recollection of the numbers, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I thank the Minister for that answer. Madam Speaker, will the Minister of Finance confirm the model used by this government to recruit and interview potential Indigenous Aboriginal candidates for positions within the N.W.T? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, one of the things that is done in the course of, well, actually, I'll start from even before the interview process takes place. What people may not realize is that there's actually quite a lot of information available on the N.W.T's HR website about how to participate in an interview, how to prepare, how to submit a resume. There's also the opportunity for people to contact someone at Human Resources to assist them with the preparation of their materials before they apply, and also to help them prepare for an interview. So I think that's probably an underutilized and perhaps not even well-known opportunity that is available. As far as once someone is in the actual interview itself, the Human Resources, Department of Finance Human Resources does use what is called behavioral-based interviews. The idea being that people are encouraged to tell stories and to speak about personal experiences rather than being asked more of the answering questions in a more formulaic way or in a more formalized way. So, and part of the idea there is that it is supposed to be an opportunity to create a better type of communication and dialogue for people in an interview. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, will the Minister of Finance confirm if the Indigenous Aboriginal culture is incorporated in the recruitment and interview process? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Sorry, Madam Speaker, I think I probably just answered that in my last description, and I may have misheard, but I didn't have my earpiece in there, Madam Speaker. But that's exactly the idea, is to try to create opportunities for anyone that's applying and anyone that's within the application process and the interview process to be able to speak and communicate in a way other than just in sort of the traditional, asking of a question and having to provide a correct or a specific answer, but to instead be able to tell stories. And Madam Speaker, part of the reason that there's been a change in the Indigenous cultural awareness training and sensitivity program is so that all members of the public service are themselves aware that there are different ways of communicating, aware that there are different backgrounds, aware that there are language differences, and that when they're engaging with someone and trying to recruit someone, that they bring that awareness with them, that they become culturally aware, and that they're a better place to actually have engagements that are more meaningful and more respectful. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, will the Minister of Finance confirm if all interviews conducted by the N.W.T have Indigenous Aboriginal team members, or at the minimum are the team members provided training with respect to Indigenous Aboriginal culture to remove any bias and provide fairness? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, I was just hoping I could pull up the numbers for human resources in terms of the number of Indigenous Aboriginal persons that are in human resources. I think their numbers actually are relatively good, notwithstanding that I cannot say that every single hiring team has an Indigenous person on that team. But I am happy to say that with the introduction of the cultural awareness and sensitivity training program that's coming out in the next few months, that is going to be mandatory for all N.W.T employees, and that once that is in place and once the staff continues to go through it, it is certainly our hope that is going to have a culture change, and that it's going to change the way that people are interacting one with another in terms of our knowledge and our awareness and our sensitivity. So I am happy to be able to at least confirm that is on the horizon, and we are hopeful that it will be a program that will be really a leader in Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate my colleagues' comments today and the Minister. I am confident that we will create targets in our departments and we'll review the affirmative action policy and make some progress on this. But I think you have to recognize that this is a systemic problem that has multiple solutions and there are multiple tools. One of those which I believe we can use is the tool of secondments. In 2015, the Minister for Human Resources announced secondments to Indigenous governments and really brought this up as a win-win situation, and that it allowed us to send N.W.T employees into our communities, to get them out of Yellowknife, to build capacity in those Indigenous governments, and hopefully ultimately devolve some of those powers. So my question for the Minister of Finance is, how many N.W.T employees are presently seconded to Indigenous governments?
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Oh, just wait.
Right now with Indigenous governments. Thank you.
Minister of Finance, can you repeat that? You didn't have the microphone.
I'm sorry, 8, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you. I do view this as a tool that ultimately allows many of our public servants, the majority of which are in Yellowknife, to get into our communities, to work with Indigenous governments, and I believe partnerships could work the other way, where we bring Indigenous governments employees into the public service, and I think we in this House agree that self-government is the future, but you also need to build that agreement and understanding within both bureaucracies. So my question for the Minister of Finance is she willing to put together something and reach out to our Indigenous governments and make sure they're aware and are willing to partnership on this tool we have? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, that's an easy yes. I'm more than happy to continue that kind of engagement. And I say continue because there is already in building capacity in Indigenous governments program. It is an effort to do precisely, I think, what the member is getting at, to support secondment arrangements with Indigenous governments across regions. There will be funding from the Department of Finance for up to 10 placements a year and up to $40,000 placement. So it is certainly my hope that that will be a successful program to encourage the exchange of knowledge, the exchange of experience, and the increasing of capacity across both governments. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, and I think part of my reason for talking about this is just so that everyone in the public service listening knows that they can go to their management and ask to be placed in an Indigenous government for a period of time, that they can go into the communities and get first-hand experience, because as much as I think cultural awareness training is a step in the right direction, there's really nothing that replaces going to work for an Indigenous government and seeing their struggles. Is the Minister willing, as part of our whole public service renewal and the number of initiatives that we are doing, to set targets for secondments? Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm inclined to say yes, but that does, I want to be cautious, Madam Speaker, that also requires ensuring that the Indigenous governments are prepared and interested and willing to be receiving all these, hopefully all these many employees who want to go and participate in this program. So what I will say is that I certainly want to see that the 10 placements that are available get filled. And so I think in and of itself there's a target there, and I'll certainly commit to keeping that 10 placements as a target. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Yellowknife North.
No further questions, Madam Speaker.
Member for oral questions, member for Montfouet.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, that the Minister of Finance just talked about HR Cultural Awareness Training Program. I certainly hope it's not a video training program. The Minister and her department has to engage the elder in the community. I just want to make that clear. Madam Speaker, the N.W.T.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to talk about how, in terms of hiring, our people are held back within the government. When the N.W.T hires, when they hire, especially the men's, they're at the bottom of the list. The Minister of Finance, I have a question for you. It's under the Minister of Finance. Their people are being hired under the Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance, who's also responsible for HR. What special initiatives is the Minister of Finance targeting this group, the young male-dominated, male employment within N.W.T, the number is so low, young Indigenous males specifically, to increase their success in a work environment? Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we are not specifically targeting men with this program. Madam Speaker, the intention is, at this point, is to target Indigenous, Aboriginal, Northerners with respect to the framework. And that would include everything from ensuring that we look at the recruitment front end of it. So if there's more Indigenous Northerners applying, I suppose if there's more Indigenous male Northerners applying, then that is more opportunity to have them hired. Once they are hired, if they are, again, able to participate in lots of the different programs that are currently available, whether it's management training, whether it's the secondment opportunities, if they're able to participate in those programs, then they're moving up in the programs. So, and if every department has targets within their departments, then each one can be held accountable to ensure that those things are happening. So all of that is part of the framework that starts from even before someone is hired right up to the point of succession into senior management. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Montfouet.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm glad the Minister brought up the target. I think it's very important to have each departmental targets. when I talk about Indigenous male at 8-9% within N.W.T. That is very low. Considering we have 50% population of Aboriginal people in the Northwest Territories, only 30% of our workforce is Aboriginal. Out of that, only 8 to 9% male. So it is disappointing to see that stats, and it's been there a long time now. I talk about decades. Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance if there can be an established targets within each department to specifically hire those individuals within Indigenous hiring. More specifically, I guess when I touch on male, because we need to increase that number as well. Merci.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, again, yes, the Indigenous framework that we are developing for the recruitment and retention framework is meant to have targets department by department, I guess that's really the answer to the question, Madam Speaker. It will have hiring targets. I have not been given any sense that men over women is going to be part of the targeting, but Indigenous affirmative action candidates will be part of those targets. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Montfouille.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm glad the Minister is committed to providing those targets within each department. It's very important that we increase our Indigenous workforce within N.W.T. Enough of talking about the 30% over the last 20, 30 years. Let's put that into action. Within the life of this Assembly, I would love to see an increase in Aboriginal representation from 30 to 40, 50%, whatever the case is. So I'm glad Ministers are committing to that. Madam Speaker, our sister territory of Nunavut understands the problem of underrepresentation of Indigenous male workforce, especially in the public service. That government has embarked on an aggressive strategy to empower young Inuit males to help them succeed in aspiration of a working environment. Is the Minister aware of those Nunavut government initiatives? What attention has she been paying attention to Nunavut approach to this issue, the challenge that we're faced with, Madam Speaker? Merci.
Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, one of the first parts of the Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework action that's happening is indeed to conduct a jurisdictional scan to ensure that we are utilizing best practices from all jurisdictions. And Nunavut is certainly a core example, as is the Yukon, that both territories will be part of that, and that we will indeed be incorporating best practices from those jurisdictions. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Montfouille.
Merci, Madam Speaker. I'm glad the Minister will be taking those best practices into consideration. I guess my question is, when can we see those adaptation into our current policy within the department or departments within N.W.T, Madam Speaker? Merci.
Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the work is already underway, and it is my expectation that both the framework and implementation plans for departments will be completed within the 21-22 fiscal. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. My question is for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. The Commission scolaire francophone des territoires du Nord-Ouest we're pleased with the new regulations on school admissions, or a few issues remain outstanding. First, can the Minister tell us why N.W.T persists in its appeals of the 2 court decisions on refused admissions under the former ministerial directive? Why don't we just drop the cases? Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of ECNE.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've made public comments on this, so it's on the record. I've had frank conversations with the chair of the CSFTNO, so we're both aware of each other's positions, and I can have a frank conversation with the member. However, as you know, Madam Speaker, Rule 24G prohibits the discussion of matters that are before the court, and I don't want to offend the rules of this Assembly. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I'm always up for a frank conversation with my friend across the chamber. There is a proposal to renovate the current Galerie Plein Soleil daycare at a cost of approximately $1.2 million. When the first request was made, funds were available from Heritage Canada if N.W.T matched the funds, but the project has been rejected twice by our government, even after Heritage Canada increased its potential funding. Can the minister explain why the project has been rejected twice, even after Heritage Canada funding was increased? Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. When the department worked closely with the proponent on the proposal to the federal government, but in the end, the cost was just too much for the GNWT. We have an early learning and childcare infrastructure fund that's $500,000 a year for the entire territory, and this our cost for this project would have been greater than that for the creation of 6 spaces, and so it couldn't be justified under that, under our fiscal reality. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. The reason why I'm raising this, of course, is the French daycare, Galerie Plein Soleil, is actually located in one of our schools, something that I think we're trying to aim for, ensuring that we make good use of our school spaces as well and co-locate daycares. So as I understand it, there was to be a dramatic improvement in the use of space in the current daycare, and that would add 6 spaces, and then a second phase would add additional spaces. And of course, increasing daycare spaces is a priority of the 19th Assembly, and so I think we're missing out on this cost-shared opportunity. When will the minister accept this proposal that will allow Galerie Plein Soleil to respond to the huge demand for daycare spaces for Francophone children in Yellowknife? Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of ECNE.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And it's not a matter of accepting the proposal. The proposal has been looked at, and as I stated, it was over $500,000 for 6 spaces, and sounds like there was a second phase, which I'm guessing would have been more. And there were additional improvements to the space. I understand that, but the fact is that we have limited resources and we have a lot of needs all over the territory, and there's competing priorities. And I wish I could fund all the spaces, and especially French first language spaces. I know that there's a limited number of those in the territory, but the numbers didn't add up in this instance, and it's a shame, but we're still willing to work closely with the proponent and see what we can do in the future. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I want to thank the Minister for that. Of course, I'm going to keep pressing this issue. My next question, though, is about GNWT policies require CSF-TNO to sometimes conduct internal workplace investigations. And of course, the employees are French-speaking. The GNWT offers assistance with workplace investigations, but in English only. So when CSF-TNO has to do this work, it costs them about $64,000 a year. Will the minister commit to working or making an arrangement with CSF-TNO to reimburse these additional costs or provide these services in French, en français? Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of ECNE.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And the member is correct that GNWT doesn't provide these services at all. It doesn't have the ability to provide these services currently. The school boards are funded for their operations, including things like workplace assessments. That said, though, I will have a discussion with the Minister of Finance and see what kind of progress we can make on this. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Montfouille.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker,
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to ask Department of Justice a question regarding there's supposed to be a new RCMP station in YELLOWKNIFE. I'd like to ask him questions regarding the Justice Department.
questions for Minister of Justice. pertaining to the process of how we allocate, whether it be a structure from one community to another community. I'm referring to RCMP detachment out of YELLOWKNIFE to N.W.T within the same region. So I'd like to know from the Minister what will be the process to establishing those types of dialogue within my region and other players involved. Merci.
Thank you. Member for Montfouille, Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I've had conversations with the member about this. I was supposed to meet with the chief of N.W.T, but our schedules didn't line up during this time, which isn't unusual. But I look forward to that conversation. So the detachment in YELLOWKNIFE is being replaced. It's a federal asset, and there is a process by which the feds surplus their goods, and that's the process we would have to follow. We did reach out to the commanding officer of G Division, and he said he's open to having that conversation to see if that can be surplused, and now it's just a matter of advancing those conversations, and I'm happy to do that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Montfouille.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker,
Madam Speaker, as we stand here today regarding the ministers, each department, they are responsible for each department, and they also work with the RCMP.
Does the Minister agree that the YELLOWKNIFE RCMP detachment should stay within the region from YELLOWKNIFE to N.W.T, where N.W.T badly needs a RCMP detachment to hold those individuals are causing issues in the community? Madam Speaker, merci.
Thank you. Member, Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And so the detachment in YELLOWKNIFE right now, I believe it's about 30 years old, and it's being replaced because it's no longer up to the RCMP standards. And so if the detachment was to be moved to N.W.T, it wouldn't be positioned as an RCMP detachment. They're getting rid of it because they don't want to use it as a detachment. That being said, in N.W.T, I know, even when I was there years ago, the chief brought this up, that if someone is detained while the RCMP are in the community, they keep them in the back of the truck for however long they need to, or they put them in the community government office. And so there's not a good system in place to hold people who are detained. And if this asset was transferred, then it doesn't meet RCMP standards, but I don't believe an office or the back of a cruiser would either in terms of that. So I can't say whether or not I believe it should be. I'm not sure what condition the building is in, what the cost would be to move this building. There's a lot of these variables. In some instances, it's very expensive to try and lift up a building and haul it and set it up somewhere else, and might fall apart along the way. So there's a lot to look into, but it could be an improvement over what's in place now, and I'm happy, like I said, I'm happy to look into that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Montfouille.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister about the process and also engaging the community chiefs, my provincial government. And so I'd like to know from the Minister what kind of engagement have taken place so far with respect to RCMP, RCMP, the Commissioner, and also at the federal level within the Justice Department and my leadership. Could the Minister provide me with an update of what's been happening or what will be the process of engaging those parties? Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Member, Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And as I stated earlier, the member was an intermediary between myself and the Chief in N.W.T, and we were supposed to meet. Things didn't line up, and so we haven't had that meeting yet, but I'm happy to have those meetings, work with the member, and meet with the Toronto government. We've already reached out to the RCMP, and now we need to take that next step, and I've told the department we need to take that next step sooner than later. So the wheels are turning, and I'm committed to moving forward with this and exploring any options that we have, and including the member and updating the member as we make progress. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member from Montfouille, final.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker,
today in N.W.T, and they've been asking for the station for a long time. We have 2 RCMP in the community. sometimes when they're in a situation, where are they going to hold the people? They don't have any place. They have a small building that they hold people there, which is not right. So I'd like to ask the minister a question.
Obviously, the community of N.W.T has been pushing for RCMP detachment for a number of years. And I think this is a great opportunity for us. Yes, it may not be suitable, but it is a facility that can be utilized in some form or fashion in N.W.T. So what I'm after, Madam Speaker, is can we expedite this process where during the winter roads coming from YELLOWKNIFE to N.W.T, if we can reach out to our CPG division, the federal counterparts, to expedite the process, so at least try and make it before this winter road or the following winter road if it's possible. The community is badly expressing a need for detachment in N.W.T. Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And when the federal government's involved, I can't really commit to expediting. It's just the nature of the beast. But you know, I told the department that it's probably been a month since this first came up, and that I want to start moving on it immediately. And so I'm doing my best. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tabacha.
Madam Speaker, I want to be able to ask the Minister of Lands, what is the Minister's policy on enforcement on reserve lands?
Thank you. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Presently, we do not enforce policies on reserve land. However, the member has asked in a meeting with Salt River that we look into this. I've made a commitment to her and to the chief that we will be reaching out to the federal government to try to work with that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha.
Madam Speaker, it is extremely important that the government of the Northwest Territories makes policy with the federal government to ensure that enforcement on reserve lands is a priority. The people belong to the Northwest Territories. Just because we have an affirmed land claim, does that mean we're different, even though we're residents of the Northwest Territories? So I'd like to ask the Minister, when will this is there a timeline to ensure that there is enforcement on reserve lands? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Hello? Thank you, Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I've told the member there here and in the House, is that we need to work with the federal government. We need to respect the jurisdiction of both the federal government and the territorial government. What we're trying to work with them, the member has been very clear on some of the challenges that they face with ENR and with lands, so we're trying to work with this. It is a process, and we need to be respectful of the process, and again, it involves EIA as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha.
Madam Speaker, so does the Minister agree that it's all right for poachers to go on reserve lands and kill wildlife that are not supposed to be, they don't enforce anything on reserve lands? I would like to know if the Minister agrees with that. I mean, we are members of the Northwest Territories, and we have rights. Wouldn't you agree, Minister? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Please direct your questions to me, Member. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, as I've tried to explain here, and maybe I'm not getting the message out there properly, there is a process, and we need to respect the process. And on reserve lands, it's federal jurisdiction. We need to work with the federal government Salt River First Nations, and the departments to deal with this matter. I understand it's been a long-serving issue for this member when she was former chief, but we are willing to work with it. We've reached out to the federal government. We're working with EIA on this, so it's multiple departments working on it. So, Minister, Madam Speaker, we are working on it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha, final supplementary.
Madam Speaker, the claim was signed in 2002 on June the 22nd. That's 18 years. That's a long time without enforcement on reserve lands. I think it's time that this minister and the Premier in the executive realize Salt River's goals to ensure that we get enforcement on reserve lands. Wouldn't he agree? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Lands.
Thank you. I'll wear my ENR hat here. Yes, I agree we need enforcement in there, but we need to do it right, and that means we have to work with the federal governments and Salt River First Nations to deal with this matter. I understand it's been since 2002. Again, we need to work with everybody in place so we do it right. And I understand the member, and I've heard her, and we've reached out, like I said, to EIA, Salt River First Nation, to have this as a discussion, and we are working on it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Speaker. Thank you, Minister of Lands. Time for oral questions has expired. Oral questions, written questions, returns to written questions. Minister of Finance.
Please. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I do have 2 returns to written questions, which I understand, Madam Speaker, will be tabled by the clerk.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I do have a return to written question, number 17-19-2, asked by the member for Cam Lake on October 15th, 2020, regarding COVID-19 spending impacts. And Madam Speaker, I do have a return to written question asked 18-19-2, asked by the member for Cam Lake on October 15th, 2020, regarding capital budget carryovers.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's address. Petitions. Reports of Committee on Review of Bills. Reports of Standing and Special Committees. Tabling of documents. Minister of ITI.
Madam Speaker, I wish to table the following 6 documents. What we learned, Tourism Strategy, Stakeholder Engagement Strategy, 1, September to December 2019. What we learned, Tourism Strategy, Stakeholder Engagement, 2, May to June 2020. The Northwest Territories Film Commission 2020 Northwest Territories Film and Media Sector Stakeholder Engagement Report, what we heard. Interactivity transfers exceeding $250,000, April 1st to June 30th, 2020. The Public Service Annual Report 2019-2020. And further to my return to written question 18-19 bracket 2, I also wish to table the summary of capital budget carryovers April 1st, 2015 to March 31st, 2020. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Tabling of documents. Member for or Minister of ENR.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I wish to table the following document, follow-up letter for oral question 368-19 brackets 2, contracts to the Northwest Territories of businesses, a giant mine remediation project. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of MACA.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish to table the following two documents: 2019 Annual Report, Office of the Fire Marshal, and Northwest Territories 911 2019-2020 Annual Report. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notice of motion. Notice of motion. Motions. Motions. Notice of motion for the first reading of bills. Notice of motion for the first reading of bills. First reading of bills. Bill, Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Nahende, that Bill 21, Supplementary Appropriations Act, Operations Expenditures Number 2, 2020-2021 be read for the first time. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. The motion is in order and is non-debatable. All those in favour? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Bill 21 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Minister of EC&E.
Madam Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Inuvik-Boot Lake, that Bill 20, enacted to amend the Employment Standards Act, be read for the second time. This bill amends the Employment Standards Act to provide an entitlement to unpaid emergency leave for employees who are unable to perform their duties because of an emergency, add definitions that apply in respect of emergency leave and extend the definition care to apply in respect of emergency leave, establish regulation making authorities in respect of emergency leave, and provide that regulations made under those authorities may have retroactive effect, establish confidentiality requirements in relation to leave, provide an exception to the periods of notice required for group terminations that applies in the case of an unforeseeable event or circumstance, clarify that a notice of termination for a group termination may be given concurrently with an individual notice of termination, and correct inconsistencies and errors identified in the Act. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the principal. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I support part of this bill. I support the emergency leave provisions that are being brought forward. In fact, I think it probably can and should have been done as part of an omnibus bill as part of our response to the COVID pandemic. The part of the bill that causes me great concern is the exceptions to that it may provide for large layoffs. Currently in the legislation, if an employer has more than 50 employees, 4 weeks notice is required, 8 weeks if it's between 50 and 100 employees, 12 weeks between 100 and 300, and 16 weeks if it's 300 or more employees. So clearly the intention of the legislation was to ensure that the larger the employer, that there's some advance notice given to their workers, so that we don't want to flood the workplace or the labor market with people being laid off. And larger employers, I think, are also better able to provide notice of this nature, given the greater size of their business. And this is, so I'd like to, I will be asking questions around what kind of cross-jurisdictional analysis has been done, what kind of consultation was done with organized labor in the preparation of this legislation, because I think this will affect workers' rights. And I will ask what kind of additional costs may be incurred by our government when a large employer lays off a large number of employees and they come into the workplace. and they may require income assistance, other kinds of support. So I think there's going to be a cost for our government with these particular provisions. I think it's also important that decisions around exceptions need to be made by a minister. The minister needs to be making that kind of decision, and the minister should be held accountable. It should not be delegated to a staff person, and I think that we also need to look at what kind of appeal provisions may be required for this kind of process. So I certainly have a number of concerns with this bill. I look forward to a very thorough public review for the Standing Committee on Social Development, and I certainly will be encouraging organized labour to express their views on that part of the bill, and as I would all members of the public as well. So in short, Madam Speaker, I'm very supportive of the emergency leave provisions, but getting rid of or at least providing exceptions to the advance notice for larger employees, that's something that causes me great concern. Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. To the principal. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Bill 20 has had second reading and will be referred to a standing committee. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Nahende, that Bill 21, the Supplementary Appropriations Act, Operations Expenditures Number 2, 2020-2021, be read for the second time. This bill makes supplementary appropriations for operations expenditures of the Government of the Northwest Territories for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Motion is in order. To the principal. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Bill 21 has had second reading. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration of committee of the whole of bills and other matters. Minister statement 77-19 brackets 2. Table document 165-19 brackets 2. Table document 166-19 brackets 2. Table document 167-19 brackets 2. Table document 181-19 brackets 2 with member from Hay River South in the chair.
I call the Committee of the Whole to order. What is the will of the committee? Mr. Norn?
Mr. Chair, committee wishes to deal with the table document 181-19 brackets 2 capital estimates 2021, 2022, and deal with the deferred departments and the concurrence motion. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Norn. Committee, we will take a short break. We'll call the Committee of the Whole to order. Committee, we have agreed to resume consideration of table document 181-19, bracket 2, capital estimates 2021-2022. We will consider those departments that have previously been deferred by this committee. Before we return to those departments, we'll go to the Minister of Finance for some opening comments. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as this Legislative Assembly did back with the 2020-2021 main estimates, we came together collectively and worked collaboratively on an approach to commit to investing in much-needed infrastructure that is one of the priorities of this Legislative Assembly and for Northwest Territories residents. There are some commitments that arise from that approach. They are as follows. Federal Housing Co-Investment Fund, Northern Carve-Out. Communities in the Northwest Territories are in need of new construction of mixed-income, mixed-use, affordable housing. To provide eligible organizations the equity needed to apply for and start drawing down the $60 million carve-out from the Co-Investment Fund, I will commit to providing the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation a contribution of $5 million in each of 2021-22, 2022-23, and 2023-24, a total of $15 million. The funding for the first year will be included in the annual funding contribution from the Department of Finance to the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation through the 2021-22 main estimates that will be considered at the February-March 2021 session. Community infrastructure. As I had indicated during my fiscal update, COVID-19 will continue to have an impact on the government's fiscal situation. And while I am confident the federal government will continue to help mitigating that impact, it will not be 100% dollars. However, reducing the municipal funding gap is a priority for this government, although it needs to be done in a fiscally responsible manner. I therefore commit to providing municipalities a one-time top-up of $2.5 million in 2021-22 towards that municipal funding gap. The funding will be included in the 2021-22 Supplementary Appropriation Number 1 infrastructure expenditures to be considered during the February-March 2021 sitting of the Legislative Assembly. Other commitments. The Department of Infrastructure will be advancing 20 kilometres from kilometre 70 to kilometre 90 of chip seal overlay on Highway 6 to Fort Resolution in 2021-22. The department anticipates the project will start in May of 2021 and be completed by the end of September. The total estimated cost of the project is $900,000. The Department of Infrastructure will also be reviewing options to improve the access road to the Thabatcha campsite in Fort Smith. These additional chip seal projects will be funded from within the department's annual chip seal overlay program and do not require additional funding in 21-22. And as members all saw during our tour of the Northwest Territories Fire Centre during a caucus retreat earlier this year, the existing leased building is old and no longer meeting operational needs to ensure that the N.W.T is able to effectively manage forest fire activity in the Northwest Territories. I have therefore directed the Department of Finance to work with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to undertake a feasibility study by early 2021. The study will outline potential options that the Assembly may consider for a potential new fire centre. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Minister. Committee, we will start with the Department of Education, Culture and Employment. The committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We will return to the departmental summary on page 10. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I will now call the departmental summary. Education, Culture, and Employment, 2021-2022 capital estimates, $30,148,000. Does the committee agree? Agree. Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Education, Culture, and Employment is completed? Thank you, committee. We'll now move on to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. The committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We will return to the departmental summary on page 15. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I see none. I will now call the departmental summary. Environment and Natural Resources, 2021-2022, capital estimates $2,159,000. Does the committee agree? Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources is completed? Thank you, committee. We'll now move on to the Department of Finance. Committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We will return to the departmental summary on page 25. Are there any questions or comments from the department or the committee? I see none. I will now call the departmental summary. Finance, 2021-2022, capital estimates $9,254,000. Does the committee agree? Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Finance is completed? Thank you, committee. We will now move on to the Department of Health and Social Services. The committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We will return to the departmental summary on page 29. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I see none. I will now call a departmental summary. Health and Social Services, 2021-2022, capital estimates $61,120,000. Does the committee agree? Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Health and Social Services is completed? Thank you, committee. We will now move on to the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment. The committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We will return to the departmental summary on page 34. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I see none. I will call the departmental summary. Industry, Tourism, Investment, 2021-2022, capital estimates $14,250,000. Does the committee agree? Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment is completed? Thank you, committee. We'll now move on to the Department of Infrastructure. The committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We'll return to the departmental summary on page 40. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I see none. I will now call the departmental summary. Infrastructure, 2021-2022, capital estimates $292,766,000. Does the committee agree? Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Infrastructure is completed? Thank you, committee. We'll now move on to the Department of Justice. The committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We will return to the departmental summary on page 50. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I see none. I will now call a departmental summary. Justice, 2021-2022, capital estimates, $1,541,000. Does the committee agree? Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Justice is completed? Thank you, committee. We'll now move on to the Department of Lands. The committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We'll return to the departmental summary on page 58. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I see none. I will now call the departmental summary. Lands, 2021-2022, capital estimates, $234,000. Does the committee agree? Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Lands is completed? Thank you, committee. We will now move on to the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs. The committee has previously considered the activity summaries for the department. We will return to the departmental summary on page 61. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I see none. I will now call the departmental summary. Municipal and Community Affairs, 2021-2022, capital estimates, $29 million. Does the committee agree? Thank you, committee. Does the committee agree that consideration of the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs is completed? Thank you, committee. We'll now move to the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. I will remind committee that the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation is included in the capital estimates as an information item and the totals are not votable. The committee has previously considered the activity summary and will return to the corporation summary found at page 64. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I see none. Does the committee agree that consideration of the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation is complete? Thank you, committee. Does the committee agree that this concludes consideration of table document 181-19 bracket 2? Mr. Norn.
Mr. Chair, I move that consideration of table document 181-19 bracket 2 main estimates 2021-2022 be now concluded, and that table document 181-19 bracket 2 be reported and recommended as ready for further consideration in formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Norn. And I think that concludes. Forgot a page. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Table document 181-19 bracket 2 will be reported as ready for consideration in formal session to the form of an appropriation bill. Mr. Norton, what is the will of the committee?
Mr. Chair, I move that I move that the chair rise and report progress. Mr. Chair.
All those in favor? Against? Abstentions? Carried. I will now rise and report progress.
May I have the report of Committee of the Whole, member for Hay River South.
Madam Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 181-19 bracket 2 capital estimates 2021-2022 and would like to report progress with one motion carried, and that consideration of table document 181-19 bracket 2 is concluded, and that the House concur in those estimates, and that an appropriation bill be based thereon be introduced without delay. And Madam Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Cam Lake. To the motion, all those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. All right, so third reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
Madam Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Nuvik-Boot Lake, that Bill 17, an act to amend the Corrections Act, be read for the third time, and Madam Speaker, I request a recorded vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called, and the Minister has requested a recorded vote. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Hay River North, the member for Great Slave, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Det-Cho, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Montfouy, the member for Nahende, the member for Sahtu, the member for Nuvik-Boot Lake, the member for Hay River South, the member for Thabatcha, the member for Nunakput, the member for Tunade-Welladay, the member for Yellowknife South, the member for Range Lake, the member for Yellowknife Centre.
All those opposed, please stand. Abstentions, please stand. Yep. The results of the recorded vote are 17 in favor, no abstentions. The motion is carried. Bill 17 has had third reading. Bill 18. Minister of Justice.
Madam Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Nuvik-Boot Lake, that Bill 18, an act to amend the Legal Profession Act, be read for the third time, and Madam Speaker, I request a recorded vote. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called, and the Minister has requested a recorded vote. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Hay River North, the member for Great Slave, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Det-Cho, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Montfouy, the member for Nahende, the member for Sahtu, the member for Nuvik-Boot Lake, the member for Hay River South, the member for Thabatcha, the member for Nunakput, the member for Tunade-Welladay, the member for Yellowknife South, the member for Range Lake, the member for Yellowknife Centre.
Those opposed, please stand. All those abstaining, please stand. The results of the recorded vote are 17 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstentions. The motion is carried. Bill 18 has had third reading. Third reading of bills. Bill 19, Minister Vicini.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Nuvik-Boot Lake, that Bill 19, an act to amend the Student Financial Assistance Act, be read for the third time, and Madam Speaker, I request a recorded vote. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called, and the Minister has asked for a recorded vote. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Hay River North, the member for Great Slave, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Det-Cho, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Montfouy, the member for Nahende, the member for Sahtu, the member for Nuvik-Boot Lake, the member for Hay River South, the member for Thabatcha, the member for Nunakput, the member for Tunade-Welladay, the member for Yellowknife South, the member for Range Lake, the member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you. All those opposed, please stand. All those abstaining, please stand. The results of the recorded vote are 17 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. The motion is carried. Bill 19 has had third reading. Third reading of bills. Bill 21, Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Nahende, that Bill 21, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Operations Expenditures, Number 2, 2020-2021 be read for the third time. And Madam Speaker, I would request a recorded vote. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion. Member for Montfouet.
Merci, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker,
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This supplementary, we had a long discussion yesterday. Some supported it, some did not. I want to say a few words on this topic. Yesterday, there's election going on in the USA. So some of them may not have listened to our proceedings yesterday, so Madam Speaker, when we are here in this House as a MLA, the people are the one that voted us in, and we, in turn, say whatever they want us to say. It's not my own words, it's my people's words. Once I leave this building, we talk to people and we get feedback from people. So we talk to the people that we represent. Some days it's really difficult. How many times I had mentioned this. We have a lot of alcohol and drug problem, homelessness in all our communities, and we have talked about this so many times. They are the one that's giving us this information. They want us to bring it up to this session here, and I bring those forward for them. Madam Speaker, recently we have been losing a lot of young people. They are passing on. Even last week, from my region, we lost a young lady. Even though those things are happening in our communities, we still have to deal with all the issues that we have to deal with here. And now we have this important motion in front of us. I'm having a difficult time to support this motion. I am talking on behalf of the people that's not able to say anything in this House. It seems like we're creating a situation with hiring all these people with all this money. And when we think about the amount of money we're going to spend to this department and look at home where we have all these problems, it's really difficult. We are representing the people that's supporting us. Some days it's really difficult to listen to what's happening here, the amount of money that we're spending and our people are suffering. Once I leave this building, I go to a coffee shop. I would see one staggering around, and some of them will be asking me for money for coffee or sandwich. And I ask them, where are you staying, or do you have a home? They have no idea that we're meeting here. But so a lot of times they're having difficulties. They have nowhere to go. And they say that I have no one to help me, so I'm on the street, and so I am numbing myself in this way. How many times I've come across people like that? Madam Speaker, we have this bill in front of us. We had a long discussion, so I'm not going to... yesterday we did talk about this, and maybe a lot of people didn't hear what we had to say yesterday.
reiterate some of the things I've said in my clinician language. I'm just going to summarize some of them. That I simply cannot support this supplementary as it is. As you know, we had a deliberation last night, late into the night. One specific item, the Secretariat budget of $8.277 million of new funding. New funding for employees of the Secretariat. I have no other issues with the supplementary. On the supplementary items of other in subs, I have no issues. But it is very unfortunate that they're all lumped together. It's all bundled in one package. It should have been a separate item. This is a very controversial issue. If government of the day want us to approve one package, then that's what it is. Madam Speaker, I've been talking about this for the last couple of weeks now. We need to invest into our communities. What is our community needs? And I did speak in my language about the homeless people out there. Homeless people that cannot speak in this house. That's why we're the voice here. I was elected to represent my people. It's not my voice. Once I walk out of here, I usually run into my constituents or other people from the north. And they question, what are you guys doing? Why are you guys spending so much millions into this so-called secretariat? They may not use the secretariat word, some of them, because they're having a hard time speaking English. But in clinician language, there's another form of, in a way, you say, a bureaucracy. Madam Speaker, I'd just like to reiterate, since due to a U.S. election that's been happening at the same time last night, throughout the night we've been deliberating this supplementary. A lot of people may have probably missed our broadcast here. And I feel it's very important that they know where we stand on this particular subject matter on the supplementary. So I just want to reiterate what I've said yesterday, just a couple paragraphs, is just think of the $87 million over the next 4 years, what that could do for people of Northwest Territories. It could build 300 homes for homeless that I referred to earlier. Overcrowded Northerners throughout the Northwest Territories, especially the most isolated communities. Some household has 15 to 20 people living 1 or 2 bedroom houses. That's a real fact. Madam Speaker, it could construct 3 new addiction treatment centers, plus 6 badly needed community health centers across the north. It also equals to 100 classroom teachers employed over the next 5 years. Madam Speaker, it also amounts to a cash value. For those 3,000 plus struggling northern business to a tune of $29,000 per company. Just imagine the economic boost on that. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said yesterday as well, I can go on and on and on, but we don't have much time this evening to deal with this. So I'm just going to wrap things up by saying that we are losing lives out there. I've touched on it as well in my language, almost on daily basis, weekly basis, especially in my region. Last couple of weekends, we lost 2 young individuals back to back. That was very sad. That was very hard. It's very difficult to be standing here to speak to that. Very emotional. We need to turn our focus to those in needs throughout the Northwest Territories, not creating another form of a bureaucracy within N.W.T. Let's start making a difference for our Northerners. We have lost far too many people, of our people of the North. Let's not lose any more, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, in conclusion, for that reason alone, I cannot and will not support the current supplementary that's before us as presented, especially on the category of COVID Secretariat. Merci, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Member to the motion, member for Decho.
Merci, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I would like to let the residents of the Northwest Territories, especially the elderly and the sick, that I do care for their health and well-being. The issue here is, are we doing prudent spending on behalf of the people so that we can save dollars that can be used towards the small communities in terms of buying ventilation equipment, buying all the necessary items that are required for PPE for all the COVID-related issues, with Alberta travelers coming into our territory. It's a big concern because we're on the highway system, my community. I've got 4 communities on the highway system. We're seeing lots of traffic, and we've seen all summer Alberta, BC, and Quebec license plates into our territory. I stated all this yesterday, and I just wanted to reiterate it today. That shows that there is problems manning our border check stops. We're not doing a good job of that at all. I think this COVID team has been in place since March. And I spoke to it at length too, stating that we have a workforce of close to 6,000 people, 6,000 employees within the government of the Northwest Territories. And I suggested many times to the Premier and Cabinet that we should have used people from our own workforce, which would have saved us having to pay for benefits and compensation for 150 new people. That would have been significant savings. The federal government has contributed $24 million, 23.4 to the N.W.T for COVID. I would like to call it a task force. It should have been called a task force, probably. And I suggested that they use those federal dollars for this task force and not have to touch the N.W.T taxpayers' dollars. That can go to much needed compliments, as I mentioned at the start of my speech. Also, too, it's noted and it's recorded that the finance minister could not assure this House that we would get success. I mean, the funding continuing for every successive year. There was no indication of that. It could be a one-time funding pot. But they're saying on that side of the House that, of course, Prime Minister will throw money at it. every chance he has. We don't know the future of the federal politics at this point, whether there's going to be a new election or whether they may change their tune. There could be some other emergency. But this COVID is a serious business, but we need to tighten up our actions. And we should have done it with this secretariat. We could have saved a lot of money. And the N.W.T, being the highest level of government in the Northwest Territories, has to show the people, the businesses that we represent, that we can take on and be prudent and fiscally responsible in our spending. There are lots of news reports out there on social media about our isolation centers. That is another big catastrophe since day one. We're well into November, since March, November now. Nothing has improved at those isolation centers. There's still lots of people walking away from the centers. Stories of people partying all night. They got free places to stay to party. That hasn't been fixed. So we're finding that there are a lot of problems still. We've got a team in place since March, and we haven't made any headway. We keep saying, Cabinet keeps saying that we are making headway. But I didn't see anything. We're asking, we should have had all the residents that return, even from medical, that are in the isolation centers to get tested. Not the rapid testing. I'm not a big fan of an instant test because it's been shown to fail in some instances because 6 days later, symptoms can appear. I'm a fan of the lab testing. That takes about 5 days, maybe less. But you can send it out to different labs if you looked around and found them. Then we could have had that. We could have shortened isolation stay for many residents if we were to do that. But no, we don't want to do that. We want to show the people of the N.W.T that we got money to play with. And when I first come in to this assembly here, we were already at a debt level. We need to thank the federal government for raising it from 1.3 to 1.9. And like was mentioned yesterday, one forest fire in the summer will wipe out our debt level again. And we're in financial trouble. So it's just the way the government spends. The cabinet spends on that side of the house without real consultation with regular members on this side of the house who represent many of the residents of the Northwest Territories. Madam Speaker, having said that, I will not be supporting. I support all the other items on there. It's just the COVID Secretariat that's stuck in there, so I have to vote against this bill. Merci.
Thank you. To the motion, Member for Trinidad-Willowday.
Merci, Cho, Madam Chair, and I won't say too much beyond what some of my colleagues already have spoken about this motion. I will say, when this news first came up, news reports in Wuhan, China last year, about this terrible virus, COVID-19, I thought, I hope it doesn't come this way. And, all of a sudden, you start hearing that kind of trickle starting to come through, and the terrible sickness and illness. And again, Every day you were thinking, oh, I just hope it doesn't come this way. And sure enough, it did. It did make its way here. And we started here, businesses closed, businesses that kept open for 200 years, all of a sudden start closing their doors. There's operations in place, business like all kinds of, again, businesses that were open during like World War II, through the World Wars, that all of a sudden, because of COVID, they're closed now. Things we've never seen in this generation, none of us have ever experienced. And I kept wondering, I hope it doesn't come this way. And sure enough, it did. And one of the first cases hit my hometown. That was scary, but we got through that. And you know, when I did visit my hometown, I always, if the weather's nice enough, I'll go visit some of my lost loved ones. I go visit my pops at the grave. And on the way out of the graveyard in N.W.T, there's a large area there of a previous pandemic, from the flu, TB. There's some terrible, terrible scourges that hit our territory, our people really hard. And then I hope none of this ever happens again. But how do we navigate that? And in really thinking about this, again, I've spoken about this early on. When I first saw the first documents, directives come out from the cabinet side things, I thought it was some sort of like weird joke. I thought, okay, it better not be April 1st. I looked at the date, no, this is actually happening. Because looking at this, and through our responses, we're the only jurisdiction in the country that's doing this, that's creating a department to react to this. It's never been done. It's not done anywhere else. Other jurisdictions are aligning their resources to battle this through their different departments and doing it in that way. So, is this best practices? No. Do I feel this is the right thing to do? No. No, I don't feel it is. And I mentioned before yesterday, I won't spend too much more time speaking to this. I really fully believe in my heart there's a better way to go, but not this way. And but like I said, we're really thankful right now. Like our response right now has been very good. And I'm hoping and I'm praying that we don't see any loss of life through this. And I'm hoping we navigate this. And I got to respect all my colleagues' votes. We've been here just over a year now. We've all have our mandates that we got to try to navigate through this. And I really think this 8.7 million kind of will take a step back against some of our mandate items. I think there's a better way to do this. So again, I want to let everyone know that I will be speaking out against this motion and voting against it, and I do not support this part of the motion. Again, like what my colleague from Decho said, this is just a specific allocation for the COVID Secretariat. This 8.7 million is what I have an issue with. The rest, I'm okay with. And with that, I have nothing else to say. Masicho.
Thank you. To the motion, Member for Nunavut.
Madam Speaker, again, I'll repeat myself from what I said last night. As an invalid beneficiary living in my hometown of Tuktoyaktuk, 17 miles away from Tuk is Kittigaswit. We lost 3,000 people when the pandemic in the 1920s. I think that when COVID-19 first came out, we didn't know what we were doing. Everybody was in a panic. Everybody tried to do their best. Our government tried to do their best. Now we have to do our best in regards to the safety of the people of the Northwest Territories. And then for me, the money, $8 million is one life saved is worth it. I don't care about the money. I care about the safety of my people, safety of my, you know it as well as I do, that our hamlet, our communities tried to shut down the highway. like going into Nuvik, like they had to try roadblocks and stuff like that. They were so worried about the pandemic come, because growing up in Tuck, you hear stories about those days, about what happened. And it's a different, when you say pandemic or something like that, it scares people, especially our elders. And that's the most important for me, is our elders and our youth. For everything that we, you look back and we have to try to get through this together as 19 members. It's not the government. It's all of our responsibility to get through this. We have to get through this pandemic. It's a new world in regards to this COVID-19 world. And it's the safety of my constituents, our priority. And for the COVID Secretariat, I will be supporting it. And I have all the respect in the world for every one of these members in this House, Madam Speaker. And everybody has to make their own choice upon their own judgment. But when I look at this, it's bigger than that. It's bigger. It's so big, and we just hope it doesn't hit our communities. So I will be in support of it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Member to the motion. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, yesterday I was not able to speak on this matter, so I will now. With respect to the budget, I'm in support of it. There is questions with the funds being spent on the COVID Secretariat. However, we always hear people say, how much is a life worth? Well, I'm not, I say, is a life of somebody who passes away from COVID worth more than somebody who is an addict, or vice versa? Really, all lives are important, and in this instance, we have something in front of us that could have really caused devastation. We have addictions, which is devastating in itself. But we have, we focused on this one. We have to, we're talking, $8 million up until the end of this fiscal year, coming from the N.W.T. But we moved so quick on the Secretariat. We moved quick on COVID. Money was thrown at us from the feds. We threw money in. So what I would like to see is that we do the same thing with addictions. Like if we can move that fast on addictions, we can make a difference. And in Hay River as well, we've had 3-4 young people pass away. With respect to whether it was drug related, or there was always something like that involved there. So and nobody wants to see anyone pass away, old or young, for any reason whatsoever. So for me, I will support the motion. We can move money around, we can move it, but if somebody passes away, from COVID, what do we tell their family? Well, we saved some money, we moved it to something else, and maybe we could have saved that life, but we will never know. So what we need to do, I think what we have to look forward, and let's look and try and make an impact on fighting addictions and fighting homelessness. Those are the things that kill people. And and like the member for Montfouille said, he goes for coffee, or goes downtown. Same thing in Hay River. When I get home, guys are there. They're waiting for me, and they're looking for coffee. They're looking for money. They're whatever. Or sometimes they just want to talk to you as well, eh? And like I think I've told the Minister of Health is that at the end of the day, if we don't get a day shelter for these guys, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move all my furniture out of my office and turn it into a day shelter until we get one. And if that's what we have to do, because it's not just this government that has to take responsibility, it's everybody. All the residents of the N.W.T has to participate in this, and they do in some sense. A lot of people, they give food. A lot of people, will provide shelter. A lot of people will go and pay for people, for fuel bills for people. They'll pay their power bills because they know they're down, right? So I think that it's just not on this government to make change. It's everybody, and that's what I look for. I look for participation. I look to people to help out, and in Hay River we have that. We're still, we still have, people on the streets, and when I hear that they're sleeping under the under the stairs or something at the old town hall and stuff, well, that's not good, and we got to change that. The other thing that came up as well in discussions is that, and I talked to the Minister of the Power Corporation about that as well, is the issue of arrears and limiters. Like, to me, here we are, we're spending this money, yet we have people out there that maybe owe $2 million or whatever, and there's not a lot of them. And I asked her, I said, why don't we just find that money? We should try and find it within government and give those people a leg up and pay those bills for them. Because that amount of money means a lot to some people. And, those type of things. And with limiters, that's the other thing, is that, why do we even, those people go throughout the winter thinking that this might happen, hanging over their head day after day after day. Wake up not knowing if you're going to have power or not. So that's a problem. And the other thing as well is in Hay River, where we have very limited housing, public housing, what we're finding now is that people are actually moving in with people who are in housing. And of course, when that happens, policies are getting broken, and tenant agreements are are being broken, and everybody's getting threatened to get thrown out of there. But they have no other option. So what do? I would ask the minister to consider, making sure that, if that has to happen, somebody's fleeing an abusive situation, so they move in with somebody that's living in public housing for safety. Let them be there. Like, people say, oh, well, it's not safe because there's too many in the house. Well, I grew up with 7 sisters, a brother, and then my mom and dad were there, and we had a 2-bedroom house. And I'm still standing here today. I think I turned out okay. And, so, we're getting so carried away with policies and legislations and liability, and it just goes on and on to where we can't really do anything and we can't help people. So, I don't know. It just, I look at what we do and it's frustrating because I can see answers out there. And I guess coming from the private sector, I just like to go and do stuff and get it done, and again, when it comes to Secretariat, that money's, it's there. We're going to vote on it. More than likely it's going to pass. But at the same time, I would ask this government, let's get a plan together with an action plan, not a strategy. And we need an action plan to combat addictions, combat homelessness in a real manner that will save people's lives and make their lives better. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. To the motion, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I don't have anything new to add really to what my colleagues here have been already saying. I care a lot about public safety. It's something I've always incorporated into my work, and I will still continue to do so. At a young age, I even took an oath to protect it. But what I hear and see the need in this territory, and do I think that this additional money that's going to be spent is going to improve the safety or protect us better from COVID? No, I don't. I am also often hit up for money to help people fill their fuel tanks or buy groceries for their children. I'm sure it's something everybody in this room also experiences on a regular basis. So while it's hard to stand up and say that I don't support this, because as a result, some of the initiatives I really believe in, like the policing initiative, I will be voting against them as well. However, how it's presented, I can't in good faith vote now to increase government employment, given the needs of our territory. As I said yesterday, a couple $1 million that's earmarked for a few managers' salaries and office space, not when I look around and see that people don't even have proper housing. I won't be supporting this motion, this supplement. Thanks.
Thank you. To the motion, member for Tabacha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I stand before you today to say I support this supplementary. I support this supplementary because the Mayor of the town of Fort Smith, the Chief of the Salt River First Nation, and the President of the Fort Smith Métis Nation are all in support of this supplementary. They're in support of the Secretariat. I was in contact with them and as early as yesterday. And you know, safety of individuals and a community and the Northwest Territories is extremely important. I think you have to look at down south, and you see how things changed in the second wave. A lot of the Aboriginal communities were affected in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, BC, and across Canada. If one case got into the communities in the Northwest Territories and start spreading, we are in major problems here. And I think that the safety of all communities, regional centers, and the capital are important. So, you know, as a former Aboriginal leader for 12 years, and I know how I've been in that Aboriginal arena for 12 years, and the one thing I learned from the leaders of the Aboriginal people is that they care about everybody, not only themselves. And it's very humbling to be a leader of an Aboriginal group. And I try to bring that here, you know, and I'm very strong on the issues. And I feel that I'm a strong person and I'm very strong to my convictions. And this is one of my convictions. I had decided this a long time ago, but I had to make sure that everybody was in favor of it from my constituency of Tabacha. And for every person that I asked, whether they be younger or from the school or from a senior or to the church groups, they're all in favor of keeping our community safe. So therefore, I stand before you and I stand before everybody in this House with my conviction that I will be supporting this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. To the motion. Does the Minister of Finance wish to conclude the debate? Oh. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First and foremost, I appreciate all members here speaking up and voicing their concerns and their opinions here. This is what our House is about. It's about working and hearing everybody's concerns. I'm going to speak about my concern that I had. I have staff that were from Department of Lands and ENR that work in lots and lots of overtime. Other departments are in the same boat. So when we talk about the safety of our individuals, we had people that were driving to borders, or the Alberta border, again, working 10, 12 hours, then coming back. So I brought it to the Cabinet and I said, look, we need to do something about this. I personally, I can speak for myself, I said we need to deal with this. We need to look at how we're going to combat this, how we're going to organize this, and how we're going to do it. Is it perfect? No, but we're working to improve it as each day goes on. We have conversations in Cabinet. We listen to our colleagues from the other side. There are some challenges out there, and I'm not going to deny that. But this is the reality. We're in a pandemic, and we need to make some hard decisions. So we came up with this secretariat to help residents. We talk about the safety of Northerners. My colleague from the N.W.T talks about 3,000 people that died from a pandemic previously. Am I happy with that? No, because that's where my kids' ancestry comes from. So I do not want to look at any pandemic that's going to take people's lives away from it. I'm challenged with border control. In the Hendy riding, we have a gate, 2 gates, to stop people from coming in there. There is people that bypass that. The member from Date Show talked about people that came and went away. Yeah, we hear about it. I deal with it daily. But I work with my colleagues to try to get this addressed and try to fix. It is money well spent for people's lives. And that's what we got to look at. It was a hard decision. Lots of struggles for myself. And I could probably say for everybody here when they're talking about it. But it's about the residents of the Northwest Territories and how we're going to deal with it. And so I am going to stand up and support this, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. To the motion, does the Minister of Finance wish to conclude the debate?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the total cost so far of the COVID-19 pandemic is $175 million. The COVID Secretariat is just one part of that. But we've already received more than half of that, over $92.5 million from the federal government. The federal government has been a good partner in this fight. Every province and territory is fighting this fight. And the COVID Secretariat is just one. Honestly, I'd say it's quite a small part of what we're doing, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, whether we call it a secretariat or whether you call it a task force or whether you call it the COVID umbrella, it really doesn't matter. What matters is the work that it's doing. Right now, Madam Speaker, it is the primary response method that we have to implement the orders of the Chief Public Health Officer. The Chief Public Health Officer is the person in this territory who is best placed to model, to understand, to figure out the evolving nature of a disease that is sweeping across the world. She is the one that's at the front end, at the front line of figuring out how to respond to something that no one has ever been asked to respond to before. The COVID Secretariat is one small thing that we are doing here to help implement the orders that she's bringing out in the best interests of the health and safety of all the residents of the Northwest Territories. Back in March, when it was a crisis, an emergency that everyone was having to respond to, that is when this work began. And Madam Speaker, at that time, developed the response that included the isolation centres, because we didn't want anyone coming back from away and elsewhere in Canada or internationally even at the time, coming back and going into a small community where there aren't health centres, where there is overcrowding, where people have low health indicators. Those are all risk factors for COVID-19. No one is not alive to that. We're extremely alive to that, and that is exactly why we have the isolation centres, why we have the border restrictions, why we have the border patrols, why we have the patrols at the airports, because we can't let this disease get into small communities or out into regions where it would potentially have devastating consequences. And initially, as my colleague has just mentioned, Madam Speaker, it was individually, department by department, staff person by staff person, being asked to do things outside of what their job descriptions were in order to be able to be on the front lines in an urgent situation. That is not sustainable, Madam Speaker. Figuring out who was doing what, putting it all together, gathering it up, the Department of Finance did bring together the actual amounts that were spent in the first few months when all of this same work was already happening as part of our response, when we were keeping COVID-19 out of the territory. For a large part, we have had very few cases, Madam Speaker. We put all of that together, we looked at those actual numbers, and those are the numbers that inform the cost of the COVID Secretariat. The projections that we have here are based on the actual costs spread across all the departments. Only now they're being brought together. Now we can put it out on the Department of Finance website. Now it is transparent. Now I can, month by month, report exactly on what the costs are because it's all been brought together. Now that we don't have to take people away from the frontline work that they're doing in other departments because they have somewhere else where they are coordinated to do that work. Where we figured out which positions needed to be filled that couldn't be double filled or filled by redeployments who are then off of their other jobs, we figured that out in a coordinated way, and that is what's happening under this COVID Secretariat. Madam Speaker, is it a best practice? Well, Madam Speaker, I don't know that anyone knows the best practice just yet. That is exactly the challenge of governing. is to figure out the best practice as quickly as possible in an urgent situation to make sure that people are safe. Madam Speaker, CBC noted that on November 3rd in Canada there were 71 deaths from COVID-19. Yesterday, when we were debating this, there were 71 deaths in Canada from COVID-19. A week ago, there were 362 cases in Indigenous communities in Canada. This week it's at 500. Again, reported on CBC. Madam Speaker, I am sad for my Canadian colleagues and friends and neighbours, but I am also thankful that we are not facing that level of pandemic here in the territories. And let's be honest, Madam Speaker, some of that's just luck. But some of it is due to the response that we've had since day one, and it's a response that we want to continue. Madam Speaker, $8.7 million is a number that's been put out there. What that is the projected cost of just under $32 million to the end of the fiscal year, taking away what right now is the amount of federal funding that we've received that we're able to put towards the Secretariat, leaves just over $8 million, which would be N.W.T funded. But that money is not exclusively for employees. That money is meant to perform all of these different functions, from border patrols to airport monitoring, to the isolation centers, to the various contacting functions of N.W.T Protect, as well as the communications and some policy development, because we are not done in evolving our response. Just as the disease is evolving, of course the response has to evolve. And as was made plain very much yesterday, there must be things that we do all the time to make the response better, to make it more tailored, and hopefully to reduce the costs that we're seeing here, to change the way that people are being asked to respond, to change the communities where people might be able to self-isolate, to look at the different options for self-isolation, to look at the costs of it. I mean, we can't do that on the sides of our desk. We need someone to look at that and actually try to come up with a best practice. So that's part of what's included in that $8 million, Madam Speaker. And will we go out and try to get more money from the federal government? Well, of course. I don't know how many times we've answered questions on every one of our departments that we are constantly engaging. And COVID-19 has been an opportunity. There have been weekly calls between many of the departments and financial and federal ministers and FPT, or the federal, provincial, territorial ministers across Canada are all getting together to share our ideas, to share our best practices, because everyone is trying to figure out what to do. So I can't see into the future, Madam Speaker. If I could, I would know when and where the disease might arrive, but I can't. I would know perhaps how the pandemic would unfold, but I don't. But Madam Speaker, what we can do is continue to bring about the implementation of the orders that our Chief Public Health Officer is working constantly, along with her colleagues from all of Canada, to help us reduce the risk of this disease here within the territory. We're going to continue to do that, Madam Speaker. We're going to continue to do that in a way that is responsible. We're going to continue to do it in a way that is transparent. We're going to continue to report on those costs. We're going to continue to report when there can be a change, if we can in fact save money because of an evolution in the way we are responding. But Madam Speaker, the materials that are before you today in this SUP that include that COVID Secretariat include so many other things. And while we might want to parse out and say, well, it's the COVID Secretariat that's at issue, the simple fact is that at this point, it's not just the COVID Secretariat. We have to respond to the economic crisis that's been created as a result. We have to respond to the education crisis that's been created as a result. And those things are also in the supplementary appropriation. The safe restart for the school funding, some of that is here, Madam Speaker. School contributions to student financial assistance is here. Airline supports are in here. The GRIT program for ITI is here. Regional relief for local businesses, that's all here, Madam Speaker. Sports organizations for youth, that's here too. It is more than just the COVID Secretariat. It is about now becoming a social, economic response that we have to have in addition to the health response that we've had to have. So, Madam Speaker, I will also be voting, not surprisingly, in support of the SUP. Because I know, Madam Speaker, that these numbers have been costed out carefully. I know that we are going to do our best, as I've said, to continue to be transparent about them, to do even better with our communications of them. And while not everybody might support the measures, and they are hard and they are not easy for anyone to follow, it's not pleasant. The pandemic is causing tremendous strain on everyone. But, Madam Speaker, as we've gone out and engaged and explained what the Secretariat thing is, the work that it's doing, that it is actually the work that is implementing the orders that have kept us safe, support has grown. Support has grown among Indigenous governments and communities and businesses, and not everyone will support it, Madam Speaker, but that is not the job of governing. The job of governing is to try to do your best, to maintain the health and the safety of the people of the Northwest Territories, to ensure the stability of the Northwest Territories, to ensure the stability as much as possible of our response to COVID-19, so that we can do our best to continue to keep it at bay. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. The Minister has requested a recorded vote. All those in favour, please stand.
The member for Yellowknife South, the member for Range Lake, the member for Yellowknife Centre, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Yellowknife South. North, thank you. The member for Nahende, the member for Satu, the member for Inuvik-Boot Lake, the member for Hay River North, the member for Hay River South, the member for Thabacha, the member for Nunakput.
Thank you. All those opposed, please stand.
The member for Great Slave, the member for Dutchot, the member for Montfouille, the member for Tunade-Wellade.
All those abstaining, please stand. The motion, oh, sorry, Clerk, Mr. Clerk. Thank you. The results of the recorded vote are 13 in favor, 4 opposed, 0 abstention. The motion is carried. Bill 21 has had third reading. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Orders of the day. Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Orders of the day for Thursday, November 5th, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, Minister Statements, Member Statements, Returns to Oral Questions, Oral Question 358-19-2, Recognition of Visitors in the Gallery, Acknowledgements, Oral Questions, Returns to Written Questions, Replies to the Commissioner's Address, Petitions, Reports of Committees on the Review of Bills, Reports of Standing and Special Committees, Tabling of Documents, Notices of Motions, Motion 22-19-2, Motion 23-19-2, Motion 24-19-2, Motion 25-19-2. Notice of motion for first reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Committee Report 6-19-2. Minister Statement 77-19-2. Table Document 165-19-2. Table Document 166-19-2. Table Document 167-19-2. Report of Committee of the Whole. Third reading of bills. Orders of the day.
Thank you. This House stands adjourned until Thursday, November 5th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.
Order.